Well, a very good morning to you. Thank you for choosing KTN News to inform you. You're watching Morning Prime. My name is Jesse Rogers. It being a Tuesday, we delve deeper into the latest education matters. And last week was a busy week, needless to say. Of course, we saw the results of the 2021 cohort of the KCPE actually released. Smiles, jubilation across the country as candidates and parents equally were celebrating that particular batch of results. Proper to note equally that still last week, the Kenya Certificate of Secondary Education was concluded successfully. That's equally one thing to note. And that's proper since there were numerous cases of exam irregularities noted, even as the Education CS, Professor George Magoha, held to his guns, mentioning that the integrity of the exam hasn't been compromised. The KCSE is already being marked, and according to the CES, he mentioned just yesterday, we should expect the results of the KCSE before the schools reopen for the first term. That's in April for the 2022 academic calendar. So we can equally expect a lot more still within this month when it comes to the releasing of results. But right now, since the KCPE results were released, focus has automatically shifted to the placement process. Which candidates, which students will be able to get to national schools following the placement by the government. And it's equally proper to note that placement, the selection of admission into Form 1, is usually premised on the principles of merit, respective of what you got during the particular exams, equity as well, bearing in mind those who come from marginalized areas and the choice of schools, but most importantly, the capacity and the category of schools. So a lot to talk about, and a little bit later on, I'll get to introduce my panelists. Let's just take a look at this particular story that highlights the placement process as the results were announced just last week. Now, rude shock awaits candidates who scored over 400 marks, as the Education Cabinet Secretary, Professor George Magoha, said they will not be guaranteed spaces in national schools. Now, every year, Form 1 placement is done based on their performance, the school choices, affirmative action, and equity as well. However, learners who scored 400 marks and above in the KCPE exams are always guaranteed spaces in national schools. But not this time round, as Shadrach Miti reports.
As has been the norm, Class 8 candidates speak for national schools, 3 extra county and 2 county and 2 sub-county schools, just before they sit the KCPE exams. In adherence to 100% transition policy, the Ministry of Education is then required to place all the 1.2 million candidates into secondary schools based on their performance, school choices, and affirmative action. And whereas it is almost a foregone conclusion that all candidates who scored 400 marks and above will be placed in premier national schools, Education Cabinet Secretary George Magoha has this shocker.
Having 400 marks is not a guarantee that you will go to one of those top schools. I have said without water in my mouth that I will look at the map of this country and ensure that a child in Samburu, if the first child in Samburu has 370 marks, I will take that child to a top school without blinking. That's what a national school is meant to be, to cause cohesiveness and to ensure that we continue to be as one nation.
In the just released 2021 KCPE results, 11,857 candidates scored above 400 marks. Over 315,000 scored between 300 and 399 marks. Over 500,000 candidates between 200 and 299 marks, while 300,000 got between 100 and 199 marks, even as 1,000 candidates scored between 1 and 99 marks. Traditionally, all those who scored 400 marks and above would have secured automatic slots in national schools. That, however, may not be a guarantee.
If we were to do what you are thinking about, you may find that Nairobi alone fills the 2 top schools. We are going to be very fair. And if you feel that your child and you have enough money and your child should go to a top school, why don't you look for a top private school and take your child there?
There are 103 national schools which can accommodate about 30,000 students. 531 extra county schools with over 123,000 Form 1 spaces, over 1,000 county schools with a 142,000 capacity, and 7,000 sub-county schools which can accommodate over 500,000 students. Given only 11,000 scored 400 marks and above, it would be expected that all of them would be admitted in the top national schools. There are 165,000 spaces available in private secondary schools. Magoha has challenged private school owners to consider setting up more secondary schools to meet the ever-increasing demand for secondary school spaces.
Private schools whose job is to create children in primary school, and they don't want to invest even 10 cents in secondary school because theirs is basically profit. Because you look, for example, in Nairobi, there are so many private schools which are primary, and there's maybe one private secondary school to almost 100 primary schools. That's where the problem is.
Shadrach Miti, KTN News.
Well, the tough-talking CS right there, mentioning a couple of things in regards to the placement process. And the first child in Samburu, if they happen to get 370 marks, they will get assurance in a national school. And that's what he says. These national schools are supposed to, in one way or the other, enhance cohesiveness and equity. That's the process we're talking about. Allow me to introduce my panelists. Joining me, first of all, via way of Zoom, ladies first, Mudeu Kasanga, education expert. Asante sana for your time and good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me. This is quite an important discussion to have. So I'm really honored to be part of this panel.
Well, we're definitely looking forward to your input. Allow me to equally introduce the gentleman joining me in studio. My immediate left, Jasper Undimu. It's great to see you as always. Good morning, education expert.
Good morning. Thank you, Jesse.
Asante sana for your time. Michael Agwanda, always a pleasure. Asante sana for your time and karibu.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Well, education matters is clearly close to your hearts, gentlemen and ladies. So let's begin with the placement process, and perhaps we can equally reflect on the week that was in terms of the KCPE results and the process that begins thereafter, all to do with the placement. And the shocking news this time round, perhaps, is that 400 marks and above does not necessarily assure you a place in a national school. So is this good news for that student who was in a private school and happened to perform exemplary well? Your reaction, first of all.
Thank you, Jesse. Definitely it is not good news. It is very disheartening because some of these children or candidates, for that matter, who score 400 and above, they really work hard for it. They don't sleep like the rest do. They have a couple of books their parents have invested, and therefore denying them an opportunity to join their schools of choice or national schools for that case is disheartening. The reason is because there has been failure on our part, even to equip all schools equally. Some of these national schools are more equipped than other schools in the country in terms of resources, in terms of teachers. In fact, it is said that if you just join Alliance High School, your chances of scoring or your chances of passing are 95%. So there is that particular jostling of these particular schools. Previous years, for example, in 2018, 2019, when Dr. Fred Matiang'i was the CS, he said that those who scored 400 marks and above were being assured of places in some of these national schools. So it is the culture that we have allowed to continue in our society, where we view some schools as good schools and others as less good. So therefore, it is disheartening, and that is why we need to encourage more of a competence-based curriculum.
That's interesting. Agwanda, your take, because this whole process is based on a few principles: merit, what you got in the examinations, equity, so inclusiveness and cohesiveness, perhaps as the CS was mentioning, but equally the choice of schools and the space in this particular schools. Your take on the placement process this time round?
Let me start, Jesse, by congratulating my school, which is St. Anthony Wachara Christian School, for doing very, very well. And for a particular child in this community, a village school, Cecil Todaro getting 412 in a village school, literally a village school. To me, I want to say that that boy worked extra hard to get 412, and he deserves a better placement regardless of which school he went to, whether private or public school. All these kids are Kenyans' children. They will be involved in the development of this country as a result of the training they will get. Most trainings that they get come from public universities. That means that all, whether private or public, they are headed to a public university in this country, which are the best universities we have around. And therefore, if we want to demystify the entrance and literally, stereotype certain students based on which school they went to, yet when we'll be looking at what training they've gotten, we'll be, sort of evaluating them based on which colleges they went to, yet the best colleges are the universities, public universities in this country, then we really don't know what we're talking about. Now, in terms of placement, I know that I had presented this, my list of students that did very, very well to Dr. Juan, who is the PS for education. And I sent him this list because it happened to come from the same neighborhood where I come from in the village. I told him, I want to make sure that these kids get the best schools so that they can encourage others to work hard so that they can go to the best, high schools. Well, they sent me a text graciously and told me, do not be worried because the system is automated. Now, if the principal of, the PS of education is telling me that I shouldn't be worried, that these things are automated, and then the CS himself says that, look, if somebody gets 400 and above, and this person here comes from a private school, I would rather somebody who gets 300 and something from Samburu. My question is, are we then going to interfere with the automation of the selection of the students based on their grades to the best high schools in this country or to the best universities in this country? That to me should be what is worrying me. If it is automated, as the PS Dr. Juan hinted to me, then it should be automated regardless of where the child comes from. Right. It should be automated whether the child is coming from a primary a private school or a primary public school. They all are children that are coming from this country. They are all our children, and they should not be discriminated in any way. I want to believe that what Dr. Juan told me is what will happen. In other words, if they are selected in any school, it will not be based on interference of human beings, but it will be based on a system that has been put out there to help. But we must also be able to see regional balance.
All right.
And I wanted to say something about the private school and the public schools that we are having here in this country. The history of private school came as a result of special interest. In the West, it was a special interest. Public school was offering education to everybody equally. But then people soon realized that, we have a disability that are not able to catch up as fast as the other normal children. And then other institutions, parachurch and church organizations realized that, there's a bit of liberal teaching in schools that we as Christians perhaps do not subscribe to. And for that reason, how about if we started school? But the difference between private school in this country and those kind of philosophies that were based on starting private school, in this country people start private schools for two reasons. One is for business. Profit. Two, it is purely lack of schools around the vicinity where people are. If there are those public schools, they're so dilapidated that you'll be wondering whether your child will be able to get the exact education that everybody else is getting in other places where things are. As a result of that, private schools are existing because of the inability of government to provide adequate schools, a number of schools that are supposed to take care of children, infrastructure in those schools, number of teachers that are supposed to be based on a ratio of a teacher to child, ratio, so that at least a teacher to the child gets, an opportunity to understand and to be talked to. Than in situations where you have classes where there are over 150 children in one classroom. Do you expect any interaction with the teacher and the student for that reason? And so we are having institutions, private institutions, and more so primary institutions in this country, private institutions in this country, as a result of inadequacy, as a result of lack of balance, as a result of fewer institutions. The best the government can do is to work with the private schools, but not to castigate them as if they've just intruded into a space where they're not supposed to be.
That's well noted. Breaking down the history, it should be more symbiotic than parasitic between public and private schools. And good thing we have the former chair of the Kenya Private Schools Association with us. Mudheu Kasanga, your take, interestingly, on this debate in terms of equity, or is it inclusiveness and cohesiveness, that perhaps a student from a marginalized area might get a slot in a national school, having lesser marks as compared to, as an example, a student from a private school in the capital or whatnot. What's your take on that?
Now, the formula, and the formula has always taken into account merit. And a level of balance.
All right.
You come from certain regions. Can you hear?
Mudheu, apologies, the network is not too clear. We can't get you clearly. So perhaps let's give you some time to work on that, because we definitely need you to communicate, and that's not happening. As she works on that, Jasper, perhaps your take on the issue about regional balance and the importance perhaps private schools play in this whole ecosystem of education.
Absolutely. About private schools, the reality is that most children who go to private schools, parents come from a bit well-off backgrounds compared to those who go in public schools. And you find that there are some regions in this country which are very disadvantaged, and that is why when the minister talks about equity, it is something that makes sense, because you can imagine a family in northern Kenya, someone has, in their family, nobody has ever gone to university, they are poverty-stricken, and the only thing that a responsible government will do is to ensure that they also give that person an opportunity to be where others are. Because most of the children here in Nairobi, some of these private schools, the middle class, they take their children to these private schools. However, what my colleague here says is true, that parents nowadays take their children to private schools because there are no public schools around. Right now we are talking about a region like Pipeline, like Saika, where I come from. You can just barely count the public schools there. So parents are forced to take their children to private schools, not because they wish, but because of the failure of the government to establish public secondary schools. And we can largely say that the Jubilee administration has performed very poorly as far as establishing the schools are concerned. Previously, it was the community which was coming up, setting up classrooms. We also had the church coming up, setting up classrooms. But right now, we have a population explosion in Nairobi. And in the next 20 years, if schools are not going to be constructed, then we shall have private schools raking in millions of shillings, because the public education could have failed. Then on the issue about back to equity issue, whereby it is the responsibility of government to ensure that everybody is given a chance, because it doesn't really make sense where some citizens are considered to be less of the citizens because of the marks they get and all that. So therefore, I agree with the CS when he talks about the issue of equity. Every Kenyan must be given an opportunity.
Well, thank God the process is computerized, as Agwanda mentioned. But interestingly, since you mentioned something about building classrooms, just yesterday the CS Magoha mentioned that they're on course in terms of building these classrooms for the CBC curriculum. The goal was 10,000 classrooms by July this year. And interestingly, he called out private schools. Allow me to quote him. He says, I urge private schools to get serious and invest in junior secondary schools. I'm not seeing much construction, and they only need to construct one extra classroom because they already have two. So he's sort of urging these private schools to fast track the building because the CBC implementation process is already on track. Agwanda, perhaps let me start with you on that. What's your reaction?
Yes, sir, this is the best I've ever heard from CS Magoha about private school. At least finally it's being pushed to the corner to accept that indeed private schools play a bigger role in our education system in this country. And therefore it's urging them that to build more classrooms. And you know, in my school, St. Anthony Wachara Christian School in Dewa, we already have extra classes. But you know, you need to bring these people on the table and agree with them that indeed you are playing a huge role, an integral role in our education system, but not to castigate them every now and again. That is where the departure of disunity comes from. And I think the CS, I started very well, and I realized that indeed more people are investing in secondary school, in primary school, than in secondary school. But do you know why? Because there are fewer primary schools, public primary schools, than public secondary schools. In other words, the public secondary schools are better equipped, better managed, have resources, have classrooms, infrastructures are good, and are well managed. The primary level is not well managed for that reason. Fewer teachers, you know, are very dilapidated infrastructure. In fact, if you go to the villages, you'll find some classrooms today where still kids are going to classroom without walls other than the mabati on top. And some have upgraded, and I've seen the mabatis on the wall as well as the mabatis on the roof. And I can tell you, can you imagine how hot that is when Kenya is really on the hot season? And that's what happened to them. So I think it's a good thing that the CS is saying, let's engage the private schools to invest on secondary schools. But what we want is, if that is the case, then can they also involve public high school as well as private high school in the selection panel? Why do they then decide that if we're doing selection, it will only be for public secondary school? Then they need to say, just like the private universities have done, where the government is now placing students in private universities with public students in private universities. We also need to see CS Magoha saying, if you build more classrooms in secondary school, we will also place students in those private secondary schools.
Okay.
Otherwise, if we invest in this classroom and they will not be placing students there, then it will be a waste of time. So that need to be a rejoinder. We want to work with you, we will make sure you have students from that joint selection that we're giving you.
Well, scratch my back, I scratch yours, that sort of thing. But that will definitely bring in a couple of issues, and I'm pretty sure private schools have been agitating for this, that every child, irrespective of where they are, is equal. And that brings in the capitation issue and support for even those learners who are in private primary or secondary schools. What's your take on that particular issue?
Thank you, Jesse. First, I believe that government should just do its responsibility of providing education. In other countries, as my colleague here said, people go to private schools because of other reasons, not because public education has failed. But for me, I will not be in agreement that we should normalize it, that the private sector now should come and take over everything. Government should do what it is supposed to do. Because right now, as the CS, I saw the headline of the Standard, it was CS orders. Now, you are ordering a private school which do not have enough funds to establish those particular classrooms. And the CS also makes it very simple that you only need one classroom. I mean, in junior secondary, there are other things like the laboratories. You need dormitories, you need offices, you need staff room for teachers. So it is a compounded issue. And this shows that CBC was rushed. I think Mudeu Kasanga cannot agree with it. CBC was rushed in the sense that we didn't anticipate about the structures which are going to accommodate these particular learners, the teachers who are going to teach. Now that is what they call that the chicken have come home to roost.
Well, anyway, let's see how it goes. And it's proper you noted Mudeu Kasanga is still with us. We hope we'll get to hear from her after this short break, even as we continue deliberating on matters touching on placement and with sharp focus on private schools. Is it all to do with profit, or they're driven by the education